Okay, we'll move on to our second keynote, a presentation by Rod Oram. Rod has more than 30 years' experience as an international business journalist. He has worked for various publications in Europe and North America, including the Financial Times of London. Rod and his family emigrated from the UK to New Zealand in 1997. He is currently a columnist for the Sunday Star Times, a regular broadcaster on radio and television, and a frequent public speaker on business, economics, innovation, creativity and entrepreneurship in both New Zealand and global context. For more than a decade, Rod has been helping fast-growing New Zealand companies through his involvement with the Ice House, the Entrepreneurship Centre at the University of Auckland Business School. Penguin published in 2007 his book on the New Zealand economy, Reinventing Paradise. He was named the Landcorp Agricultural Commentator of the Year in 2009. In 2010, Rod was the winner of the individual category in the Vero Excellence in Business Support Awards and was Columnist of the Year in the consumer category in the National Magazine Awards for his column in Good, a consumer sustainability magazine. Rod is chairman of the Aclina Foundation, formerly the Hikarangi Foundation, which helps social enterprises develop their business models in areas of sustainability. So welcome, Rod. We look forward to your presentation.
For a moment, I thought I only had 5 minutes left. Kia ora tātou, good morning. It's a huge pleasure to be with you this morning. And I've prepared a larger presentation than I'm going to show. So if you run across some slides which have a lot more detail than we discuss, or you can't see the detail from the back of the room, don't worry, it'll all be on the PDF that I'll leave behind, and I'm sure will be easily available through the conference website. As a business journalist, spend most of my time trying to figure out what's going on in the world and what it means for us in New Zealand, both in terms of opportunities and threats. So this morning I was wanting to talk about how we can profit from very profound changes in the global economy, but they're not necessarily the ones we're locked onto at the moment. And if we could get this right, this would indeed be our next revolution. I'm going to do this in a number of different stages. I'm going to talk briefly about old New Zealand. Actually, that's us today. And I'll offer you a bit of a diagnosis about why we're really stuck as an economy. And then I will move on very briefly to talk about what's going on in the world and the revolution that's underway out there. Then I will apply that to New Zealand in a number of respects, and this will be the new New Zealand, and how it, I will argue, is a cure for our economic issues. A very important point before I launch into this. Of course, long been fascinated about how important electricity is to society, and has been for more than a century. And how important that will be in the future, how much, indeed, I can easily imagine electricity playing an even bigger role in our economies, and not just, say, for example, in transport. But of course, as you're wrestling with, you've got some very serviceable long-life assets out there, and yet how we generate electricity, how we distribute it, how we store it, how we use it, is changing incredibly quickly. And so there's an enormous challenge, not only around that evolution of technology and application of it, but the economics around how you make that transition. But the really big point I want to make is that in New Zealand, we've traditionally thought that electricity needs to be as cheap as possible to power our industrial processes to make us as competitive as possible out in the world economy. And so when you're producing low-value commodities, that's really important. And it gets to be pretty crazy, actually. So, for example, I'm familiar with one pulp and paper manufacturer that sometimes makes more money selling its electricity contracts than it does actually making pulp and paper, because electricity is such a large part of the cost of its production. And therefore, when exchange rate and pulp and paper prices are moving against it, it makes more money on selling the electricity. That's really crazy. And so what I am absolutely keen to establish as a baseline in this is that this isn't about cheap, reliable electricity for New Zealand so we can keep doing commodity things. And so I really get very nervous when people talk about, let's have huge server farms here, and just imagine all that green energy we could produce, possibly cheaply, and what a great calling card that would be. Well, possibly, except that sort of server farm isn't going to create many jobs here. It's an utterly commodity activity. So that's why I'm a huge fan of electricity, but not as a way of cheap electricity under supporting low-value activity. Having got that off my chest, let's launch into the world. This chart is from the Reserve Bank, and it shows you how growth is tracking in various countries there. So Australia is not doing so well right now, but that's the yellow. And then red is Asia minus Japan, and then blue is the rest of the developed countries. So in many ways, the global economy has recovered quite a lot of poise and some momentum post-global financial crisis. Whether that's Europe starting to recover a bit, although Australia is slogging, the US is strengthening, and Asia is succeeding pretty well. The basic message here is that there's plenty going on in the world for us to earn a living, but that's not what's happening. So this is a chart which was in the budget forecasts from Treasury accompanying the government's budget back in May. Each of those bars is important because there's two there. The blue is the potential growth rate, i.e. how fast can we grow the economy without causing inflation. And then the black is the real or the forecast of what actually happens. And as you can see, as we look out currently and then into the forecast period, economic activity quite significantly exceeds capacity. In other words, we are running the machine faster than we should be, and that's why we're starting to cause inflationary pressure. And the other point about this growth is that it's very heavily driven by high dairy prices, which are now coming back, and high log prices, which are also coming back, and of course by the rebuild of Christchurch. And once that growth peaks at about 3.5% or 4% by about the middle of next year, it starts to come back to round about 2%, which is our long-term growth rate, which isn't enough, of course, to be lifting our standards of living and the rest. So here you can see the contribution of growth. Net exports are a negative. That's because they're starting to come back, and as economic growth accelerates, imports are starting to rise. And in fact, the export picture is particularly important to analyze in more detail as to the trends there. So this chart shows you the volume of exports, which is the lower black line, and we really struggle to raise the volume of exports. It's very hard to raise productivity in agriculture beyond about 2% a year. And of course there is a limit to how much more land we can bring into agriculture. There's a limit to how much sheep and beef land, for example, we can convert into dairying. The blue line is the value, and of course that shot up because of a big spike in global dairy prices, which have now started since mid-February of this year to come back. So whole milk powder is coming back to round about $3,500 a ton, which is its long-term kind of market clearing price. So if you look at our exports last year, in value terms, it looked absolutely fantastic. Our exports to China were up 45%, and China became our largest trading partner, displacing Australia. But in fact, including China, exports to the entire world only rose by 4.4%. Similarly, dairy exports looked spectacularly good, recovering from a drought and then enjoying high prices as well. But again, overall exports are only up 4.4%. They've backed off a little bit since, and then the Treasury forecasts in the budget were that export growth is only going to average about 2.2% a year over the next 4 years. This is a very constrained economy, which is the main message I want to give about how New Zealand's placed at the moment. Given those constraints, I won't try and unpick this chart for you, but it basically involves our trading account, exports versus imports, and our services account and an investment account. And overall, that gives us the current account balance. Yesterday, we reported, in dollar terms, a record current account deficit, i.e. the net of our financial flows with the rest of the world. And Treasury is forecasting that will deepen over coming years, heading for about 6% of GDP. So, this is one chart that seeks to encapsulate what's going on in terms of the challenge for New Zealand. This is a recent report done by the OECD for New Zealand, for our Productivity Commission. And what this is showing us is that if you look at New Zealand's settings in terms of its policies and what should be achievable in the economy, our GDP per capita should be round about $43,000 a year, well above the OECD average. But in fact, it is only about $30,000. Now, that's not because somehow we are inefficient or lazy. We have various constraints to overcome. And as you can see here, in the middle of that chart, where why the productivity gap, the main point that the Productivity Commission and the OECD make is about our international connections. It's about where we sit in global value chains. And that gap between the reality and the theory is about 30%. That's a big gap in which to pick up. The government is very careful to say it doesn't actually have it's very reluctant to use the word economic strategy. Instead, it talks about its business growth agenda. And it is quite honest about saying we believe strategies sound all very good, but they don't necessarily work. We're just kind of trying to have an agenda to move things on. So the business growth agenda is about delivering more 6 ingredients to business growth: export markets, innovation, skilled and safe workplaces, capital markets, natural resources, and infrastructure. However, whilst there's a lot of good stuff going on there, it's actually about driving incremental change in what we're already doing. It's about doing a bit more, a bit better. There are some big goals, particularly to lift exports from 30% to 40% of GDP. That's a very good goal to have, but that would require exports to grow by between 5.5% and 7.5% a year, but Treasury is only forecasting that they're going to grow by 2.2% a year over the next 4 years. So looking at that kind of data and other analysis, and you'll see a slide in the PDF that develops that theme some more, by simple arithmetic, it's actually not possible to double exports by 2025 or to lift exports from 30% to 40% of GDP, which is the government's goals. This chart shows that a few spectacular countries, like Ireland, have magnificently changed the ratio of exports to GDP, but they've only done so by developing whole new industries. And that's not what we're planning to do in New Zealand. Once you disentangle all the spaghetti in there, you'll see that our exports have always been about 30% of GDP since back in the 1970s. And our last economic revolution, from the late 80s to the early 90s, turned this economy inside out, made it fantastically more flexible and efficient, but we kept doing the same thing. So exports have remained at about 30% of GDP. A bit of diagnosis, and it's around value chains. The World Economic Forum, in its Global Competitiveness report every year, does a very good job trying to analyze how economies create value. And it boils down a great deal of data into a scale of 1 to 7. So 1 is low-cost natural resources, and all the way out the other end is 7 at unique products and services. New Zealand scores about 3.8, which is about in the middle, which looks okay, except that's only 36th in the world. So that's how we create value. Then the next issue is how much of that value do we then capture out in the global economy. Again, the World Economic Forum has a scale of 1 to 7, where 1, you're doing something requires a lot of capital, it's difficult to do, like mining for iron ore and coal and shipping it off, but that's essentially only one step in that value chain. And then all the way out the other end, you're making money not just selling goods and services to people, but giving them after-sales service and the rest. It so happens we also score 3.8, but now we rank 58th in the world. So in other words, we are struggling to create high value from what we do, and then even so, we're leaving money on the table. And here's 2 stories about that. If you look at the total value of our food and drink on the dock, as it's going for export, it's about $25 billion worth a couple of years ago when this research was done. But the actual end price for consumers is somewhere between $140 and $200 billion. Now, we can't capture all that because inevitably and rightly some things are happening with our ingredients after we sell them to somebody else. And other people have profit and margin in there, such as wholesalers and distributors. But here's one story about how this works. For many years, Fonterra has been making infant formula for, at the time, Pfizer, the US drugs company. Nice business, had about 8% market share in China. But Pfizer didn't want this business. It had put it together as leftovers from 2 acquisitions. It bought drugs companies and got human nutrition. It kept the drugs and sold the human nutrition. There was a bidding war. Nestle paid $12 billion for that business at the beginning of last year. What we get out of that is our farmers get the commodity milk price for selling milk to their co-op, to Fonterra. Fonterra gets a toll processing fee for turning that into infant formula for now Nestle. And that's kind of like all we get out of it. That transaction was 3 times the net asset value of Fonterra at the time. What's Fonterra doing? It actually has some very interesting downstream higher value investments, but most of those are going in overseas. Its idea of downstream higher value investment in New Zealand is, for example, the plant at Waitoa in the Waikato that it opened a few months ago to produce UHT milk for China. Meanwhile, Mengniu, the largest Chinese dairy company, is building at Pocono, just over the Bombay Hills, a very large infant formula plant. It plans to backwards, and it'll start by buying milk from Fonterra. Then it's going to backwards integrate into drying its own milk, collecting and drying its own milk, and then it's possibly going to backwards integrate into farms too. So in other words, that's the sort of integrated investment that's going on in New Zealand, increasingly by overseas companies, not by New Zealand companies. Now, that is not an attack on foreign investment. Like Ireland, I would love to have foreign investment in New Zealand that enabled us to do something we can't do ourselves. But we can do this stuff ourselves. So it's a net economic negative when somebody else comes in and does it for us. The world. I'm going to touch briefly on 2 reports, and if they pique your interest, you can download them or find more on the PDF. The first one is, going back to the World Economic Forum, they do a risk analysis every year. 2 years ago, their risk analysis was particularly interesting because it showed the interdependence of the risks in the world. Now, you won't be able to read this from the back of the room, so let me talk you through it. Across the bottom is the likelihood of a risk happening. So the further right, the bigger the risk, or the more likely it is to happen. And then the vertical axis is the impact. So we're really interested in what's the top right-hand corner. And that's around water, it's around food, it's around extreme volatility in energy and agricultural prices, it's about severe income disparity, it's about a whole bunch of very interdependent factors. So this is becoming an extremely volatile world at which that amplitude and frequency of volatility is increasing markedly, not just through the likes of the global financial crisis. How are we coping with this? Well, I often turn to this report when I'm thinking about this in a kind of an integrated way. This Vision 2050 document was from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, major companies like Unilever and Nestlé. And I will draw on two charts from this. The first one is this one. Across the bottom is the Human Development Index. So each of those dots is a country. The further you come to the right, the more developed you are. Higher living standard, longer life, that kind of stuff. The vertical axis is the ecological footprint available per person, per hectare. And the higher dotted line is 1967, just under 4 hectares per person. And the lower line is 2006, just under 2 hectares per person. What happened in the intervening decades? More people, each of us putting more demand on that footprint. So if we are to achieve sustainability in terms of a good, stable, highly developed societies, and within that ecological footprint, we all have to be in that blue box by 2050, and nobody is. I'm about to show you another chart. This is what the future looks like according to the World Business Council. So across the bottom, each of those pillars is the likes of people's values, human development, economy, agriculture, forests, energy and power, buildings, mobility and transport. The dark blue is the stuff we have to do by 2020 if we're to stand any chance of doing the big stuff beyond that. This is absolutely an unprecedented scale, speed, and complexity of change which humankind has never come within cooey of before. So if you've got long life assets and slowly evolving technology, you need to consider how you too can be part of unprecedented speed, scale and complexity of change. And there is stuff for you in there, whether it's energy and power and buildings and mobility. So fairly conventional things out to 2020 about business models that better integrate more efficient and alternative drivetrains in transport, lowering the cost of renewables. And then we get into the really big stuff out to 2020 before we get to abundant low-carbon energy. So that's kind of your task between now and 2050. I'll keep checking back regularly to see how you're getting on. What underlies this is a very important principle that, and it's about sustainability. The Harvard Business Review is back in 2009, this isn't new, but I keep repeating it, was saying that there's no alternative to developing like this. And this is where all the best business opportunities lie. So if you're not locked onto this, you'll be left for dust. My phrase, not theirs. That gets to be a little Harvard, unlike Harvard Business Review. So, revolution. I'm going to tell one story in a little detail because it's one of my favorite stories, but it's also about, in a sense, a very conventional technology and what it can deliver when it innovates very fast. So whilst I hope you'll enjoy the story itself, I hope it'll trigger some thoughts about your own technology and the way you deliver it. You probably have no idea who this person is. Very few people would. That's Malcolm McLean, and he invented the shipping container. And the first ship converted from a tanker to a little container ship sailed from Newark for Houston in 1956 with 58 of those containers on board. The impact since has been totally extraordinary of what containerization has delivered. So if you just look at free trade agreements, the benefit of a free trade agreement over the first 20 years is about a 45% lift in trade. If a company joins GATT, and now the WTO, very big lift, about 285% over the first 20 years. But containers deliver a 320% lift in trade in the first 5 years of adoption, and that's trade plus productivity growth, and 720% in the first 20 years after adoption. So it's not just about the frameworks, it's not just about the standards, which a trade agreement represents, it's about the technology that's used to actually deliver on them. And I won't dwell on the productivity gains here, but this is a fabulous piece that was in The Economist last year, and so if you click on that link, it'll take you to that piece that explores these issues in detail. So, what does the future hold, and what happens with shipping? This is a chart showing stages in container ship development since 1956. And you'll see how rapidly the development has been in the last 10 or 15 years. And we've come down to the Triple E class from Maersk. The first of those ships was launched in the middle of last year. And those Triple E's can carry 18,000 containers, in a ship that's 400 meters long. These ships are the largest sailing in the world, bar the very last of the very large crude carriers which are still around. And that's a Photoshop of what 18,000 containers would look like in Times Square. This is a totally extraordinary ship, not because it's large, but because of the energy efficiency that it's achieved with this enormous scale-up. So even just the step up from the previous very large class of Maersk ship, which was in itself was at the leading edge and is barely 6 or 8 years old, this is about a third a reduction in energy required per ton per kilometre, and of course a remarkable reduction in CO2 as well. So the idea that you can keep pushing technology with all the most modern adaptations to it to deliver something quite spectacular, I think is, I hope, a message that has some resonance with you. This is, I've yet to see one, I'm looking forward to it. This is a truly extraordinary ship. It is by far the world's most efficient ship. However, there is a problem. There is an imbalance of trade between China and the rest of the world and back to China. So when this ship is fully loaded, going from China to Europe, it is the world's most efficient ship. But going back the other way, it's often rather lightly loaded and becomes the most inefficient ship, according to the deputy editor of Lloyd's List. But we'll solve that problem. So the business is starting to lock on to all of these issues about volatility in finance and economies, about low-carbon economies, about trying to restore public trust in business, about trying to adapt to social and demographic change. And this is a fine report from the Confederation of British Industry that tackles that. So we've got things like natural capitalism, where companies are starting to put the environment on their balance sheets as both a liability and an asset, depending at which stage they are in using it. It's about reinventing what we do, so we reuse things back to parts per billion like nature does, you know, way beyond recycling. It's about marvelous companies like Interface in the US, which makes only humble carpet tiles, but has radically changed the way it works. It's about the likes of the Living Building Challenge, starting in the States and spreading widely. This is the fabulous Bullitt Center in Seattle, an absolute model of energy self-containment and efficiency. It's about making new fuel technologies and electricity technologies economically practical, as Bloom does. And even more extraordinary, it's the likes of biomimicry, where we're trying to borrow technology from nature to have a really big impact on what we do. And lastly, it's about the next industrial revolution, which is, of course, 3D manufacturing in various ways. And one of the most extraordinarily articulate people about this is Professor Neil Gershenfeld at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who runs the Center for Bits and Atoms, i.e. bringing together IT and materials down to the atomic level, and various YouTube clips, and you'll find some in the links in the PDF, give you a sense of how astonishingly rapidly this is coming. It's already here, and how spectacularly far-reaching this technology is going to be. What about New Zealand in this? We have our own vision of 2050, done with the help of the World Business Council, done by some of our best and brightest young leaders from business and other areas. Links to the New Zealand version and the global version there. And this is for a vision for a country of 6 billion people living extremely well with its ecosystem by 2050. A different structure on each of those pillars, but marvelous to explore. When I'm workshopping this with people, I bring in a huge wall chart of this, which is great fun to work with. But you can download it and mull over it yourselves. So what does the cure look like? Very little of New Zealand business locks onto this at all. That's why it's really important that some of our best business leaders like Stephen Tyndall, Rob Fife, Rob Morrison, and Philip Mills have and got together the Pure Advantage program that they fund. And looking at sectors like these, all the way from housing and geothermal out to biodiversity, as to where those opportunities lie for us. And I'll offer you an example. This is actually in the government's primary growth partnership, but the idea of it came out of Pure Advantage. So this is Stump to Pump. This is Norske Skog down at the Kaurau Mill, declining demand for paper, particularly newsprint, and therefore it has a wonderful wood resource, it has wood waste, and it has fabulous geothermal power. And Z Energy is a shareholder in the Marsden Point refinery. So what they're trying to do, and they are exploring, is the technology and the integrated system whereby they could start producing ethanol, but from this wood waste in economic ways, to then start feeding into our liquid transport needs. We are incredibly well resourced in New Zealand for projects like this. Of all the developed countries in the world, we are the most dependent on our natural environment for our standard of living and the way we earn a living. Biology is our biggest science. We are best at commercializing biology than anything else. So this sort of thing is a complete natural for us. One other big theme. This is work from KPMG and Trucost in the UK. Those are global industry sectors. The blue is their profits, the red is their uncosted environmental cost that is not built into their business model. Now, you might wonder about oil and gas, very large profits, apparently only a small uncosted environmental impact. That is because this analysis only goes as far as the production, not the consumption of the product. So in other words, for the oil and gas industry, you'd add a great deal more uncosted on top of that if you added in the consumption of its products. But note, the only global sector where profits are substantially lower than the uncosted environmental dynamic is agriculture. So typically farmers would say, well, we can't afford to deal with the environmental issue because we don't earn enough to do that. But that's really, really disastrously old thinking. So, for example, the greenhouse gases, some 20 million tons of them that arise from our dairy production, that end up in the atmosphere, or constituents end up in our waterways, those are essentially all nutrients. So we have a farming system that's leaking 20 million tons of nutrients a year. So what will we need to do in our farming system to close those loops? So that, not just here but around the world, is the fabulous opportunity to redesign the farming system to close those loops so we can produce more food and profitably and with less environmental impact. We do have some New Zealand companies that are beginning to lock on to this kind of global connectivity which makes this work. I call them vanguard companies, and it's the sort of company I hugely enjoy working with. For me, they've got 5 characteristics. They have absolutely inspired products and services which offer really unique value. We're not talking commodities here. How they do that has a real originality born out of their New Zealandness. Thirdly, they have very smart strategies for getting out to the world. Fourthly, they have very astute management skills to do the hardest thing in business, getting together the people, the technology, and the money they need to do what they want to do. But the biggest thing is, which enables all the rest, is they have the confidence and skill to collaborate with whoever they need, wherever they need around the world. And this isn't just exporters. These are the importers who bring us the most brilliant technology in the world. Like many of you in this room, you are bringing the best technology in the world to New Zealand. You're making it work for us economically. You're supporting it. So you too can be a vanguard company if you're performing that function in the electricity sector. And then, of course, this also applies to companies which are purely domestic companies. They're neither importers or exporters, but they're trying to model this and deliver it for their consumers. My favorite example to date is Comvita. It started by, it's been a long-running company, but its transformation started in 2004 when it floated on the NZX to raise some funds. It used the money to buy back its distribution in the UK, so it had more control over its customers and pricing, and therefore captured more of the money, which it then reinvested in buying back distribution in Australia and in Europe. It started investing in retail. It has 600 stores within stores across Asia. It started investing a lot more in science to prove what the medicinal value of Manuka honey was, and then moving into other raw materials such as olive leaf extract, and again always proving the science of that. And latterly it's been moving upstream into bees to make sure it has a secure supply. So this is a very virtuous cycle where each step generates a new cash flow to take the next step in value building. And it has some great relationships. So, for example, for wound dressings and serious infection dressings with an American company, Medihoney. And by the time you work up that value chain, by the time that honey ends up in an aseptic package for use in an operating theatre or an emergency room, that honey, still the same honey, is worth 55 times a boring old tub of clover honey in a supermarket. You're all very familiar with what Rod Dreher is up to. An extraordinary story in terms of absolutely understanding where the world was heading and being ahead of that. So I love this one from Rod, that it's about building a quadruple B business, building a billion-dollar business from the beach. His house actually isn't quite close to the beach, up in the Hawke's Bay, but nearby. And to make this work, we need hundreds and hundreds of more of these New Zealand companies, as the University of Auckland's Entrepreneurship Centre advocates. Lastly, I'm only a journalist. I'm a one-man band with a little help from my wife. And, sorry, that's in business terms, and all sorts of personal ways as well. So how do I model this? There's not much point in just talking about it. So in 2008, we we put solar water heating panels on our house. We were replumbing our 70-year-old house at the time. Our plumbers refused to do solar water heating. They said it's rubbish. I said, no, no, we are doing it. I will find it. I find it, you put it on. And I found a company that was putting solar water panels on dairy sheds, and I figured if it was good enough for farmers, it's good enough for me. And the plumbers liked it so much, they bought a system and put it on their offices. And now there are quite a range of swimming pools in Remuera and other nice parts of Auckland which are heated by the same systems. It's quite satisfying. And in the process, we cut our electricity bill by 30%. But it was a nasty old roof on an otherwise fabulous house. So we started last year working out how to convert from hot air gas-fired ducted heating to a heat pump, to double glazing, to a new roof with generous insulation, with LED lighting, and realigning and upgrading the solar water panels, and putting in 5 kilowatts of PV. I think we only turned the PV on in March the 10th. We're going to generate close to enough electricity for this now thermally pretty efficient house. This is the work underway over the turn of the year. And this is what we found when we took the old roof off. We found a wonderful Kauri frame, and cladding was concrete, reinforced concrete panels about that thick. I don't know how on earth the builder of this house got those building materials in 1943 during the war, but he did. I assume it was a he. So anyway, it's turned out to be a very worthwhile project. This is the roof. That's some of the PVs. This is what we've generated from March the 10th. So that's the rest of March, April, and of course that's only June so far. We've obviously dropped off as the days have shortened. But on a good day, even at this late stage in the year, we're still doing about 12 kilowatt hours a day. And we were doing 27, I think was our best day so far back in March. So I'm very much looking forward to next December. And I felt really excited when we had generated our first megawatt of power. That was really exciting. I'm modelling this financially, and it's me versus Doug Heffernan and Mark Binns and all the other big guys. So I could have put money, I could have put $20,000 into buying SOE shares, but I thought the model was crazy. All that retail churn, all that cost of overhead of all that retail churn, all those locked in on old assets. I just don't buy the SOE story at all. And so over the next 5 years, I'm going to work out whether I'm going to have a better return on investment through this or buying the SOE shares. Actually, just buying Mighty River Power shares, by not buying them, I'm already ahead of the game. Not quite the same with Genesis because of a ridiculously high yield or the part payment on Meridian, but we'll gloss over those details. But I'm really excited about going head-to-head with the big guys. We're generating more electricity we need. I would love to buy a Tesla S. I'm not paid enough from speaking engagements to afford one. Sorry, that's not a pitch for more, because I'm also interested in how you modify technology. So I have a 10-year-old Prius. It'll do 20 kilometers to a litre, but it's not designed to be all electric. I can just about get 1.5 or 2 kilometers all battery along Tamaki Drive with the wind behind me. But almost finished. I've been promising this a long time, but when a friend does it and you're not paying him, it sometimes gets a bit slow. I am sticking 10 kilowatt hours of batteries under the floor of the boot. It's quite expensive conversion, but I get a plug-in hybrid for about $20,000, which is much less than half I would pay for a new one if I could get one in New Zealand. And I'm going to be getting about 80 kilometers at highway speed on batteries, or if I keep it in hybrid mode, I'll be down to about 2.5 litres per 100 kilometers. I want to have an all-electric car. They don't quite meet my needs or my budget yet, but I'm going to hang on to this car until it arrives, and then I'm going to hang on to this car for a very long time because I'm very fond of it. Anyway, that's the other part of the modelling, and if the exchange rate falls and the price of fuel goes up, I'm ahead. If Greens and Labour come in and they lower the price of electricity and I get less money selling into the grid, that's fine too, because that'll drop the exchange rate and I'll be coming out ahead on the car. So the car is my hedge against politics. We've only just started on land. I won't even dwell on what happens out in the oceans. That's our very biggest challenge. We have the 5th largest oceanic resource in the world. We've hardly begun to understand how to use that sustainably. I'll save that for another day, because it'll be a while before you have tidal power out there. And I just want to leave one last thought. You'll have no future if you don't make one for yourself. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you, Rod. We are running pretty close to lunch, but I think there's probably a chance for 1 or 2 questions. On the left hand. Pat, is it?
Thank you. Pat Bodger, University of Canterbury. You presented a lot of graphs of economic indicators earlier on, but underpinning every economy in the world is energy. You gave no graphs on energy rate of return or energy return on investment. Unless a technology adoption produces more energy, ultimately that is put into developing the technology, it's not a candidate for sustainability. Milk powder in New Zealand comes from solar energy. There's a limit through availability and accessibility of energy resources that will limit our economy. It's a physical limit. I'd like your thoughts on that, because I didn't see any evidence of discussion of that.
2 parts to that. The first one is, of course, new technology has to displace old technology. It probably needs to do so on the economics of it. And I get quite excited about that. I've never believed in feed-in tariffs, for example, for new technologies. And I believe that my PVs are cost compatible with grid electricity. I believe that's where we've got to. I'm down to about this installation cost was about $4 a watt. And the technology is still very young. So how on earth we know this is going to develop enormously, both in terms of improvements in PV itself, but also the ability to store it on the premises. I believe the sheer weight of technology change is driving this. There will also be political change. And whether that's some pricing of carbon, that's welcome. But I don't believe it's going to be necessary. As Sheikh Yamani famously quoted or commented during the Arab oil embargoes in the 1970s, the Stone Age didn't end through a lack of stones, and nor will the oil age end through a lack of oil. So they're going to run it. We're going to move on to other things before we run out. In terms of the second point you raised about the limits to production in dairying, that's absolutely true. So for me, the big challenge is not to get our slowly growing volume of commodity products out to those hundreds of millions of consumers around the world and sort of eke out a living of about $7 a kilogram of milk solids. But what do we actually do with that milk? What's the science of that milk? So we can start making $17 a kilogram of milk solids, or $27, or $37. And that's the challenge for the dairy industry, one that it's not taking up. And if I look across all of the sectors of the New Zealand economy, I could, in broad terms, articulate a similar kind of case, a similar kind of transformation. And as you might have detected, I'm slightly frustrated that compared with what's going on in some pockets elsewhere in the world, we are not locking onto this stuff at all.
So, yes, sorry, I probably can't take another question just because of time constraints. So could I ask Taz Scott to come to the stage to present our vote of thanks to Rod?
Well, Rod, to me that was a fascinating address, and you're a consummate communicator. I wrote down entertaining, incisive, very stimulating. The patient was New Zealand, and you're the specialist doctor diagnosing things, yeah. But, yeah, the patient's not dead. It's still going. And there's some bright aspects there to its future, because you explained some examples to us about what you're talking about, which I thought was very useful. So please join me in thanking Rod for his presentation.